Welcome to the deep dive. We're starting today with something that's, well, maybe a bit of a head scratcher.
hmm
Why did the Protestant church, in its early days, why did it seem to struggle so much with a global mission?
Yeah, compared to other traditions, it's noticeable.
Bishop Stephen Neal, he put it pretty bluntly, didn't he? Said their first attempts achieved exceedingly little.
He did.
Yeah.
Especially when you contrast it with, say, the Catholic orders back in the 16th, 17th centuries. They were incredibly active.
Right. So what was going on there? Let's unpack that.
Well, the core issue, it seems, wasn't necessarily a lack of desire, but maybe a fundamental difference in approach.
Okay. How so?
The early Protestant thinking often seemed to assume that global mission was purely the job of the established church leadership, the main structures.
Ah, okay. And that leads us right into the main thing we're digging into today, doesn't it?
Exactly.
This kind of historical, maybe suspicion within Protestantism about separate mission organizations.
Right. Some leaders worried they might, split the church's unity, or they just didn't see a clear biblical go-ahead for them.
So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to really understand this relationship, which has often been a bit tense between the church hierarchies and these mission agencies.
And maybe see how that perceived breach could be healed, or at least better understood.
Yeah, because looking bigger picture, we're talking about how churches and these voluntary groups can work together better, right?
Mm-hmm. Negotiating new ways of working together, new social contracts, you could say, to tackle big problems and, well, achieve greater good.
Okay, so to get a handle on this, we need a framework. And you mentioned Ralph Winter's two structures theory is key here.
Absolutely key. He talked about modality and sodality. It helps make sense of mission organizations.
And the really interesting bit you said is that this isn't some modern idea.
Not at all, according to Winter. He argued it actually has roots stretching way back to the New Testament itself.
Okay, so break down these two structures for us. What's the difference?
So the modality, that's basically what we usually think of as the local church, the congregation.
Right, like a family gathering, old, young, men, women, everyone together.
Exactly. It's like the biological family model, in a way, open to all within that community.
And the sodality.
That's more like Paul's missionary band. Think mobile, voluntary, focused on a specific task.
Okay.
Often made up of committed, experienced adults making a kind of second decision, a specific commitment beyond just general church membership, a specialized team.
Got it. But not everyone bought into this distinction, right? You mentioned Bruce Camp had objections.
Yeah, he raised a valid point. He argued against limiting who's in the church based on, say, age or specific commitments. He felt there was really just one structure, the congregation, the denomination, that inclusive body.
Okay, so a counter-argument there. But Winter looked further back in history, didn't he? Beyond the New Testament, even.
He did. He argued these two structures weren't just invented for the New Testament church. They actually grew out of existing Jewish ways of organizing in the first century.
Which were?
The synagogue, which, pretty clearly evolved into the congregation model.
Makes sense.
And the kevra, which was the prototype for the missionary band, the sodality.
Kevra. Okay, what does that mean?
It's Hebrew. It means something like a membership society, an association, fraternity, even a guild. It's related to the word kever, meaning friend.
So like-minded people joining together for a purpose.
Exactly. And these were common in New Testament times. The Pharisees, the Essenes, Sadducees, they were essentially kevrot.
Huh. Even informal groups, like our rabbi and his disciples.
Quite possibly, yeah. And they still exist today, these associations. If you're curious, you can actually Google kevra or chobura, chevra, havura. You'll find modern examples.
Interesting. So what characterized these groups? What did membership involve?
Typically, it meant mutual accountability, encouraging each other, regular worship, often Shabbat evenings, studying Torah together and sharing communal meals, a tighter bond, often.
And we see hints of this structure in the New Testament itself.
Winter thought so. Those wandering exorcists in Acts 19, John the Baptist's disciples, probably kevrot.
And Jesus calling the 12.
He essentially formed a kevra, yeah, for a specific preaching mission.
So you had the synagogue, open to all Jews in the community, and then these kevrot, more selective, based on commitment or a shared focus.
Precisely. And these were the organizational patterns people like Peter and Paul knew. They were just familiar.
And this pattern isn't just ancient history.
No, not at all. Daniel Elzar pointed out that even today, in modern Jewish society, the U.S., you see this normal relationship between synagogues and these voluntary, task-focused membership groups.
And they're not seen as secondary, like para-synagogue.
Not typically, no.
Yeah.
They're often seen as equally important, sometimes even more central to community life, depending on their focus. It's a whole panoply of organizations, as you put it.
So Winter's big point here is that the New Testament reflects this pre-existing understood pattern. Both the church, like the synagogue, and the missionary band, like the kevra.
Exactly. And Paul, as a former Pharisee, just adapted these structures.
Yeah.
That missionary band, the Sodality, is what Winter called the second of the two redemptive structures.
But not necessarily less important, just different.
Right. Pello, interpreting Winter, noted that neither structure is inherently more central. Though generally the church structure, the modality, often provides the context or regulates the specialized structure, the sodality.
Okay, so the key takeaway from this section. Paul and the apostles used both familiar Jewish structures. The congregation wasn't the single divine instrument.
And therefore, mission agencies aren't just some later add-on or merely parachurch. They have a legitimate, historical, even biblical precedent.
That's a really different way of looking at it.
It is. And William Carey, the missionary pioneer, he offered another useful way to think about it.
What was that?
He drew a parallel between mission agencies and private trading companies.
Private trading companies, like businesses.
Yeah. It helps understand their relationship with church hierarchies, kind of like the relationship between governments and corporations.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does that comparison work?
Well, think about governments and free societies. They legalized the formation of corporations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Peter Drucker called the corporation the first autonomous institution in centuries, independent of national governments.
And they've had a massive impact.
Huge. Micklethwaite and Wooldridge argue they're fundamental to Western prosperity, driving progress globally. They contrast this with civilizations that lack that kind of robust private sector.
So there's a link between having these independent companies and a society's, well, success.
There seems to be a correlation, yeah. The number of private companies can indicate a country's status, even its political freedom. Friedrich and Brzezinski noted that banning private organizations is a classic trait of totalitarian regimes.
Whereas democracies allow these voluntary associations which empower individuals.
Exactly. Hayek warned about this in Road to Serfdom, the danger of too much central control versus the dynamism of voluntary cooperation.
You know, I remember hearing someone call the limited liability corporation the greatest single discovery of modern times. Nicholas Murray Butler.
That's the one. Even more important than steam or electricity, he claimed.
Which sounds like hyperbole, but...
But his reasoning was that it was an enabling technology, a paradigm shift, as Micklethwaite, Wooldridge, and Drucker also argued. It unlocked new ways of organizing and getting big things done.
Okay, so how did Carey connect this powerful idea to missions?
In his famous inquiry, he explicitly uses the word company when talking about his proposal. He references things like the Dutch East India Company and other private trading ventures. That was his model.
So he literally proposed forming a mission company.
Yes, a company of serious Christians with rules, plans for selecting missionaries, fundraising methods. He stressed needing dedicated, persevering people, totally committed.
And the timing of this was significant in England, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Just before Carey wrote, the Enabling Act of 1779 had passed. This allowed citizens to form schools and associations independent of the official Anglican Church.
Ah, okay.
Think about Robert Raikes starting his Sunday school in 1780. That probably wouldn't have happened easily without that legal change. It shows the link between a free society allowing independent groups and these religious initiatives taking off.
It's easy for us now to just assume you can form a company or association.
Right. But back then, it was very much a political creation. It required government action, granting privileges like limited liability.
And Robert Lowe called corporations these little republics.
Yeah, suggesting they function with a degree of autonomy, often left alone by the government.
So the parallel with mission agencies is...
Both have a board of directors accountable for results. Both need recognition and some regulation from a higher authority government for corporations, maybe the church hierarchy for agencies.
Okay, which brings us back full circle to why some church leaders felt uneasy about these mission agencies. What were the specific worries?
Often it was about, well, perceived overlap. Aren't they doing what the local church should be doing? Or concerns about funding. Are they diverting money from the main church budget?
Practical concerns.
Very practical.
Mm-hmm.
But Andrew Walls pointed out that, historically, the church, as it was then organized, often couldn't effectively do overseas missions. It needed other means.
The voluntary societies filled that gap.
They did. But Walls also noted, significantly, that these societies subverted all the classical forms of church government. They shook things up.
So you've got this inherent tension, the value of order in the church structure versus the value of autonomy for the mission agency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Max Warren called it an inevitability of tension, though he also warned that too much tension makes effective work impossible.
Is there a way to ease that tension?
Bruce Bowers suggested a helpful perspective. If church leaders see their primary role as organization, unity, worship, nurture for existing members, and mission leaders see their focus as action, mobility, specific tasks beyond the local congregation, then maybe there's more room for mutual acceptance. Less friction.
Right, clarifying roles. What about that term parachurch? It often carries a negative weight, doesn't it?
It really does. Stephen Board pointed out it often implies these groups are only needed because the real church isn't doing its job properly.
Sort of a backup plan or a second best.
Exactly. Winter contrasted this sharply with how Catholicism views its religious orders. They're integral. But similar Protestant structures get dismissed as parachurch.
And Winter had a provocative counterpoint.
He did. He suggested that maybe modern American congregations have drifted so far from the original New Testament ecclesias that it would be just as reasonable to call them paramission structures, structures alongside the primary mission task.
Wow, that flips the script entirely.
He does. His point was that calling only the congregation or denomination the church ignores that other essential structure, the missionary band, the sodality that's right there in the New Testament.
And didn't someone else point out that mission came first historically?
Eugene Tissell, yeah. He noted that itinerant traveling ministry often preceded the establishment of local ministry in the early church. Mission had a kind of original authority.
So Darrell Guder also pushed back against seeing mission groups as just right? Paraparochial, almost a church.
Yes, Guder urged a completely missiological approach. Start with the mission. Meaning, the church is God's instrument for God's purposes. Its structure should flow from God's mission, God's nature, God's goals.
Not just from tradition or existing hierarchy.
Exactly. This view questions locking mission into only one form. The church exists, Guder says, emphatically for the sake of mission.
And if that's your starting point?
The terms like parachurch, with their implied first-class church, second-class church ranking, become, as Guder put it, ultimately impossible, or at least unhelpful.
So the fundamental question isn't structure first, but mission first.
What is the mission of the church, and how does that mission define its forms? That's Guder's core question.
And he found support for this view in Karl Barth's theology.
He did. Barth wrote about special working fellowships of the church, Besondere Arbeitsgemeinschaften der Kirche. Waldron Scott believed Barth saw these sodalities as proper and even indispensable.
Not just optional extras, but necessary.
Necessary. Guder describes Barth's theology as thoroughly missional. He saw the church as one mission expressing itself in many diverse organizational ways.
So Barth embraced variety.
Absolutely. He spoke of a variety of these special working fellowships, each with its own particular form of witness, all empowered by the Holy Spirit.
And the Spirit doesn't force everyone into the same mold.
No. Barth stressed that the Spirit doesn't create uniformity. The Christian community's activity is manifold, always new and different.
Guder then connects this history and theology to a challenge for today.
Yes, he calls for the church to move from church with mission, like mission is just one department, to missional church, where mission defines everything.
And he sees that historical split between church structures and voluntary societies in Protestantism as a key part of the current challenge.
He does. He argues the church's future effectiveness really depends on a paradigm shift, recognizing that these voluntary structures, these sodalities, actually align with patterns used by Jesus and Paul.
And these kinds of groups aren't unique to Christianity, are they?
Not at all. The tendency to form focused, like-minded groups, sodalities, it's found across cultures. They're often how societies tackle root problems.
Like Carey believed forming special associations was the way to achieve that glorious prize of tackling big evils.
Evils like ignorance and barbarism, in his words. He saw association as the necessary means.
Okay, so if this is the ideal, how do we get there? How do we build a healthier model, a self-governing missional model?
Well, building on that idea from the prospering parachurch, it starts with church leaders essentially giving a license, creating the space for these mission organizations to exist and operate.
And Richard Hutcheson suggested looking at the Catholic model.
Yeah, he pointed to their lay and priestly religious orders. They have internal autonomy, focus on specific missional interests, and can connect directly with church members for support.
And the Protestant equivalent, he argued, is the voluntary association.
Exactly. Hutcheson felt that centrally planned denominational structures often stifle individuals who have a passion for a specific cause and want to direct their support there.
So he outlined some elements for a denominational approach that embraces this pluralism.
He did things like genuinely accepting these special interest groups, planning that actually listens to donor intentions, promoting the whole range of work, including letting groups promote themselves, using general funds and designated funds effectively, guaranteeing designated gifts go where intended.
That seems crucial.
Absolutely. And allowing designated giving to actually influence priorities without the central office just shuffling other money around to compensate. And, fundamentally, intending to serve all the diverse groups within the church body.
So this new social contract would mean denominational leaders recognize the mission agency boards as autonomous in their core operations budget, fundraising, direction.
Basically, yes. Mirroring that Catholic model in principle, validating these voluntary societies as legitimate partners.
Ralph Winter thought this was an area ripe for change too, right?
He did. He felt centralized boards just couldn't fully capture or express the diverse visions within a large constituency. He predicted creative structural changes would happen here.
And we actually have a concrete example of a denomination that made a big shift like this. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the LCMS.
Yes, a really significant example. Before the mid-90s, their mission work was largely centrally planned and controlled.
And after?
After 1996, they made a deliberate shift. They started officially recognizing and even promoting independent mission agencies that were formed by their own pastors and members.
So bottom-up initiatives being embraced top-down.
Pretty much. They even assigned staff to help these groups with the practicalities, like getting incorporated.
And did it make a difference?
A huge difference. The number of these independent LCMS mission agencies just exploded. From maybe a handful to 52 by 1999, 65 by 2003, over 75 by 2008.
Wow. And these operate with official blessing, but not direct control.
That's the key. Consent and promotion, but not control from headquarters.
You mentioned some examples earlier, Alaska Mission for Christ, Apple of His Eye.
Right. Friends of Indonesia, Hajmong Mission Society, Missio Dei Network, Sudanese Lutheran Mission Society, Tian Shan Mission Society, a real variety of specialized focuses.
And organizationally, how do they work?
Each one is its own entity, its own board, its own bylaws, its own IRS tax number, its own bank account. Independent.
But they have a relationship with the main denomination.
Yes, through what they call Recognized Service Organization, or RSO status. This allows them to solicit funds within the LCMS and access benefits like pension and health care.
In exchange for?
An annual audit and ensuring their work aligns with the Synod's overall aims. Some also have more formal partnership agreements, though not all participate in the RSO program.
So there's flexibility.
Yes. And there's practical support, too. That staff member who advises on incorporation provides starter kits. Plus, an association called ALMA helps them with fundraising and communication.
They even have gatherings.
ALMA holds an annual gathering, yeah, for networking, sharing best practices, interacting with the LCMS World Mission staff.
And the official view from LCMS leadership.
People like Steve Huey from LCMS World Mission basically said it makes sense. Given financial constraints on the central body, why not partner with and empower the initiative coming from diverse groups within the church?
So the LCMS essentially validated the right of their members to form these little republics for missions.
Exactly. They found a way for minority interests and specialized passions to work harmoniously with church officials, not against them. It allows for pluralism within the structure.
It sounds like a potential model for others.
Many think so. It addresses that core tension. Paul Pearson agrees that traditional church structures are built more for stability, while frontier missions need more freedom. History backs that up.
And it challenges the idea that local churches normally start missions.
Yeah, Paul Beals argued that, but the empirical evidence often suggests otherwise. Churches frequently respond to initiatives started by individuals or groups who felt called to organize voluntarily.
Okay, so the LCMS model looks like a type C relationship, maybe, going back to Ralph Winter's categories.
It leans strongly that way. Winter laid out 4 types based on his research in the 70s.
Can you quickly recap those?
Sure. Type A mission agency is basically a department of the church, administered by a church-appointed board, funded through the main budget. Think traditional mainline denominations like Presbyterian Church, USA, Episcopalian, Methodist.
Okay, tight control.
Very. Then Type B, similar relationship, But the agency raises its own support, not just relying on a budget percentage. Many Type A missions started as Type B.
A bit more independence in funding.
Right. Then Type C. A close relationship with the church body. But the agency has its own board, sets its own budget, raises its own funds. It's recognized, but not controlled. Examples: Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society, now World Venture, and the Conservative Baptist Association. Carey's original society fits here. And importantly, all Catholic orders are Type C.
And Type D.
Type D. No special relationship to any specific church body. Think agencies associated with networks like Cross Global Link. Completely independent.
So A, B, and C are denominationally related to varying degrees.
Correct. And Winter's observation was that American Protestant missions often fell into the extremes. Type A, total control, or Type D, total independence. He called it the bear hug or abandonment syndrome.
He preferred the middle ground.
He strongly advocated for Types B and especially Type C.
The Type C relationship sounds like the LCMS model. The church hierarchy recognizes these member-initiated groups in exchange for accountability, like annual reports.
Precisely. It's a negotiated partnership. Robert Weingartner's description of those 19th century Presbyterian women's societies as a loose confederation of quasi-independent groups also sounds very Type C.
So, pulling it all together, the main argument is that effective leadership, whether in government or the church, involves negotiating these kinds of social contracts with voluntary groups.
Yes. To address the big problems, you need to empower focused action, like Carey wanting to do something about ignorance and barbarism through these associations.
And sociology and history seem to back this up. People naturally form groups, and Carey's approach demonstrably broke the Protestant mission deadlock.
It really did. So Winter's two structures paradigm, recognizing both the congregation modality and the mission band sodality, seems to align better with the Bible, with human nature, and with historical effectiveness than just seeing the hierarchy as the only game in town.
Why the resistance, then, historically? Thomas Kuhn's idea about paradigm shifts.
Exactly. Kuhn explained that established ways of thinking resist change. A paradigm shift only happens when the new model is seen as reflecting reality better. Winter and others argue the two structures model is closer to reality.
And the LCMS example shows that repairing that historical breach is possible.
It serves as a powerful example, validating these member-initiated corporations, or little republics,
Which, like business corporations, become centers of power and initiative that wise governments or church hierarchies regulate and partner with, rather than trying to micromanage.
Right. Robert Worley talked about needing a political style in the church that encourages openness, allows differences to be visible, and lets minority groups form coalitions without being labeled enemies.
There was a biblical analogy mentioned near the end, Bonaventure.
Ah, yes, Bonaventure's reflection on the calling of Peter in Luke 5. Peter's boat is overflowing with fish, and he calls for help. Another boat comes, unnamed fishermen. Bonaventure saw this second boat as representing these voluntary associations, the Sodalities, playing a necessary role alongside the main structure.
A necessary partner for the abundant catch.
Exactly. Initiating and supporting such associations seems like a wise strategy for tackling today's challenges.
And Andrew Walls brings it right up to the present, doesn't he?
He does. He reminds us that throughout history, proclaiming the gospel required new means sodalities beyond the local church structure. Monasteries were revolutionary, even disruptive. He suggests the sodalities needed today might be just as, well, disturbing to established structures, but potentially just as vital.
Okay. So, to kind of wrap up this deep dive, we've traced this historical tension between church hierarchies and mission agencies. We've explored the biblical and historical roots for seeing mission involving both the congregation, the modality, and these voluntary focus groups, the sodality, Winter's two structures.
We saw the value in viewing mission agencies as these little republics, much like corporations, needing autonomy to be effective.
And the critical importance of a collaborative relationship, a social contract, where church leadership recognizes, supports, and partners with the independent work of these mission agencies.
That kind of partnership really holds the potential to bridge that old divide in Protestantism and hopefully unleash a much greater capacity for doing good in the world.
So for you, the listener, maybe the final thought is, what does this two structures model mean for how you understand the church's role? How can all the different gifts and passions find expression?
Maybe explore some of those modern kevrot we mentioned, or look into how different denominations relate to mission agencies today.
What kind of second boat might be needed now in our time to help bring in the harvest? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring the deep with us.